as we speak, the world is impacted by major conflicts. But there's not only the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza that should be at the forefront of our attention. We have over 55 conflicts across the globe, which are all impacting on people's individual lives.
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says Rolling Stones don't gather moss? Hello everyone, I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. International dialogue, civil society, North, South, East, and West, coalitions, and the struggle for peace. Where do they all come together? Is there a legitimate way in which youth and civil society can be actively involved in bringing about a peaceful world? As I sit here and speak into the mic, I can hear the silent echoes of a world increasingly torn by conflict. And as I reflect on my last conversations with youth from war zones, I still remember the words, "This is enough." Nobody seems to want wars. So why is the world careening towards that end, even at a faster pace than ever before? Today I have the pleasure and the possibility of getting some answers from a person whose life has been deeply entrenched in the work of peace building and conflict prevention across borders. He has worked and lived in Vietnam, Thailand, Netherlands, Germany, Bahamas, and Sri Lanka. And currently he's based in The Hague, working with a development agency called Cordaid. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining me today. I did not mention your surname because I was afraid of mispronouncing it.
Thank you very much, Meena, and good to be here with you today. And surname is not a problem. You can just call me Peter.
Okay, perfect. So before we go down many rabbit holes, why do you do what you do?
Oh, you start with a difficult question as a first one. Yeah, I'm doing the work as an expert on conflict prevention and peace building for many years now. And I do that out of conviction that I do think that there is merit in continuously striving toward inclusion and striving towards a solution towards a more resilient and peaceful world. And if I would not have that conviction, if I would not believe that there is possibility of moving forward on that, I would have stopped maybe at one point. I do think there is always ways of trying, forging greater efforts towards conflict prevention, addressing grievances, addressing the needs of people across the globe, and also striving towards a more peaceful world.
Okay, so essentially it's with your conviction and belief that you do what you do.
Yeah, but as I said, there's the conviction and belief, but there's also the assumption that what we do as a platform, and then maybe I have to say also a few words on the work that I do. I'm coordinating the civil society platform for peace building and state building, which is a global network of civil society organizations actually working towards a dialogue solution for conflicts and issues around conflicts. And the way we do work is that we do believe that through dialogue and through talking with each other, there's always space for moving closer together and always space to actually address some of the root causes of conflict and fragility in a dialogue. And I do think that over the last years, over the past decades, we have seen things moving forward. We have also seen things going back. As you said also in your introduction, the world is not as peaceful as we had it. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But I do think that the work does contribute to elements moving.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to ask you that question. Tell me something more about the international dialogue on peace building. How does this dialogue cross different cultures, values, belief systems, communication methods, and ways of being?
The dialogue has been in existence ever since 2008. So it has been a standard element in the international political dialogue sphere for quite some time now. It came together out of a realization that the aid towards fragile and conflict-affected countries needed to be channeled in a different way and more direct by governments, and people of fragile and conflict-affected countries could actually take ownership and to take the lead in addressing some of the root cause of conflict and fragility in within their borders, but also within their relationships with other countries. The dialogue came about by bringing together the governments of the so-called fragile and conflict countries, which are coming together as a group of G7 plus countries, donors working on addressing the wicked problems, fragility, conflict, and violence, coming together under a group called INCAF, the International Network on Conflict and Fragility, hosted by the OECD TAC in Paris. And the third leg of that unique partnership is civil society, coordinated through the Civil Society Platform for Peacebuilding and Stable. As I said earlier, this platform brings together a wide array of civil society actors working both in fragile settings, but also working at the international level, trying to bring in the voice of civil society into this tripartite dialogue. The dialogue came about, as I said, in finding novel ways and more direct ways in providing aid support to fragile countries. It led, after a few years of dialoguing among the three constituencies, also led to a landmark agreement called the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, concluded in 2011 in Busan in South Korea. That agreement was unique and forward-looking in terms of how can we indeed shape our development policies on the ground in a different way, where there is an assessment done on what a country's priorities should be, and also donors and civil society as partners try to support those governments in the best possible manner in making that agenda a reality. So that's where we come from as an international dialogue that's been long in existence, bringing together governments from fragile and conflict countries, in total 20 countries, donor agencies from across the world who have been supporting that fragility, conflict, and violence agenda, and then civil society organizations, which we bring together under the heading of this platform, coordinating over, I think now we are close to 60 countries where we have presence on the ground, but also coordinating advocacy and policy influencing at the international level on issues that civil society feels that it needs to bring to the forefront.
Actually, that's an immense amount of coordination. So, my next question then would be, when multiple organizations come together for the purpose of peace, does it not lead to a situation of too many cooks spoil the broth?
Is always a potential threat. But I do think that the partners in the international dialogue come together out of a conviction that there is a merit in actually sitting together around the same table and having an open and frank discussion about these issues, and seeing also what each other party can contribute in having the dialogue about the issues at hand, but also having a dialogue about possible solutions that you want to jointly put your support behind, but also where you can bring in your contribution as constituency member to issues that potentially your government counterparts or your donor counterparts are grappling with. So that is where the coordination between those three constituencies happen. At the same time, in civil society platform and its diversity that we bring to the table, I mean, we have hundreds of members if we look at across our membership and the countries where we are. It is also on basis of an agreed upon mission and how we engage with each other. The agenda is predominantly dominated by local partners in the countries where they feeling the pulse of the nation and where they see what is needed to come together on conflict prevention and peace building. So our local partners in a country like Chad or a country like Mali or a country like Burkina, they determine themselves how and where they would want to bring the agenda forward. They will look at potential support from the platform in guiding them with experiences from other countries, or potentially also to help amplify certain messages coming from the local level to an international level. So in that sense, the coordination also happens very much at the local level where it needs to happen and where things need to change that you want.
But when we are talking about countries sitting at a table to try and come to a unified decision, you rightly said diversity, you use that word. We are essentially talking about immense diversity, looking at becoming an inclusive picture in practice. How does that process happen in general? You mentioned, yes, coordination, including the local organizations. I'm assuming those local organizations help bridge the culture, value, belief system, and communication method gap, right? How do you come from that immense diversity to an inclusive picture?
Going back to my earlier point about how this international dialogue was constituted and what glue is between the three different constituencies coming together in this partnership is the realization that there is merit and benefit in actually having an open and frank discussion among the three constituents. And yes, partners come around the table with a diverse background and maybe also a diverse worldview on how they see things evolving. But the merit is here to have an open and frank political dialogue process among like-minded, though from a different background, but like-minded people who want to find solutions to the wicked problems of conflict and fragility. There is obviously a diversity in background, a diversity in cultural background, a diversity in how government representatives or civil society representatives, donor representatives perceive the reality and what they think they could potentially bring to find solutions for some of the issues that play a role. At the same time, I think that there is the chapeau of an international dialogue partnership and an agreement that you share with your peers in that context, with your constituency partners, your issues that you're grappling with, but also potential solutions, but to the benefit also of cross-fertilization between the constituencies, also between partners around the table, that might or potentially can lead to problems being solved at another end of the globe. It's that kind of process that this dialogue has been continuously working with, but also trying to find a kind of a common ground between three constituencies and what the shared concerns are towards how the world is moving away from resilience and peacefulness, and try to find intervention ways and collaboration methods that help to bring more resilient and sustainable peace to the fore.
Thank you for sharing that. Could you share an example of one such experience?
This often referenced, but the international dialogue, as I said, has first evolved into a partnership that was supporting the implementation of the New Deal for engagement in fragile states. And that was actually in-country assessments on the potential drivers and root causes of conflict and fragility and devising ways of addressing these through policy changes and policy commitments. Over time, it has evolved also in its engagement at the international level, given the fact that when the partnership emerged, we still were in the MDG era, and the MDG era was one striking element that was missing in that framework for development assistance was the lack of attention to governance and peace issues. So the partnership in the international dialogue on peacebuilding has collectively successfully lobbied for the inclusion of what is now called SDG 16 on peaceful, just and inclusive society. Because out of the realization and the lived-through experience that you cannot address the issues around development and making progress on the development agenda if you don't also address the issues around governance and how to bring a more peaceful society together. That realization and that shared commitment has led to a lobby towards the 2015 agenda, the follow-up, that need to be enshrined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and has eventually led to the inclusion of that goal 16. So that's a very concrete. Not saying that it's only due to this partnership, but we have been as three constituencies together and collectively very much at the forefront of the lobby for the inclusion of that important goal, which I think is also an enabler and an important cornerstone of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable.
You mentioned about the reason for conflict. That actually is something which I, in any case, wanted to ask. If everybody wants peace, why is there conflict? Egos, misunderstandings, religion, greed. What is it?
That is not an easy question to answer. Yeah? I think inevitably it leads back to power and the desire for power and the needs or the want to control power over others, where conflicts might arise. And that power question is active and can be related to in many aspects of states or countries situation, whether it's over natural resources, whether it's over people, certain subgroups in society. It all has to do with the recognition or the exclusion of elements, not granting of access to resources which should be unifiedly shared. And I think that obviously, per country and per setting it will differ. It's often that power imbalance and elements of exclusion that leads to grid, which then also can lead to conflict.
That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that power imbalance and the element of inclusion. That makes sense. And do you agree that natural resources will more and more become the basis of conflict in times to come?
But in the context of our work and the context of how we see within the reality of our partners, working reality, so to say, in the countries and in the places where they do their work, it is increasingly so that natural resources and the pressure on the availability of natural resources becomes a more and more dominant to take into account, even with the increasing impact of climate change and the fact that the availability of natural resources, availability of certain resources becomes scarcer and putting pressure on the limited resources that might often be there already is an increasing factor that we see our partners taking into account. It's also the reason why we have been, from the peacebuilding conflict prevention side, also branching out to colleagues working more in the climate change sector, given the fact that we do see that interrelatedness and that the intersection and how climate change is impacting on conflict and vice versa. There's a direct interrelation that is becoming more and more a dominant relationship where we need to also relate ourselves to, which we increasingly are doing and cannot be not doing.
Yeah, I gather that. And you've worked and lived in multiple countries on the east and the west side of the world, as well as the north and the south. So, what is the most significant difference in thinking styles between the east and west when we talk of diplomacy?
I have been lucky indeed to have been exposed to different kind of working relationships and working context in which I've been pursuing my professional career, and it has been an utmost pleasure to have these kind of different experiences gathered. And it's also difficult to make a comparison. I think that per country, even in the work that I do now, and I'm working with multiple partner countries and having contacts with civil society colleagues from all over the world, there's obviously a difference in the situation, but also the communication around the situation. But there's not so much difference, I think, in the level of how people want to see change happen and what their commitment are towards the role of civil society in peace process and conflict prevention processes, nor the way they see the utility of the use of diplomacy and diplomatic tools to actually strive towards greater acknowledgement of the contribution civil society can bring or the contribution they themselves can bring. And I think that the striking difference, if I look at it from, okay, what has been now compared, if I have to make a comparison, I think there's a vast difference between working at what I'm doing now and what I did in the past at a more headquarters level of an organization, and then relating via emails and Zoom and Teams calls with our partners on the ground and accidentally visiting them if I have the opportunity to do so, or yourself working at the more local level and doing the work in those contexts more directly yourself. So that I do see there's a vast difference, but both elements are as important because you cannot at the international level do work without that connection to the local level and vice versa. I think that interrelationship and the way these relationships need to be nurtured, but also need to be used, and the way we can amplify messaging coming from a local level is key important. That is also in the DNA of the platform that I'm coordinating, that we see that as utmost important, that whatever we do at the international level to try to influence and to move the needle on conflict prevention and peace, having other stakeholders, other partners hear also the voices of those most impacted is of key importance. And that amplification is something that I think also a perceived need from our local partners, that they want to be heard, but they also want to be seen in terms of what they can potentially contribute or what they're already bringing to the forefront in manifesting change and manifesting a better world in their country.
And I remember you mentioned that the inclusion of society, civil society, and if I'm assuming youth might be also involved, since that was some years back, it started, right? But from that time, from the time when civil society was included as part of the bodies involved in arriving at certain peace building decisions, What is the change that you noticed?
Maybe going back to my earlier point about the international dialogue and why we see that from the civil society point as an important partnership for us to engage in. Because we very much believe in the meaningful inclusion of civil society and other stakeholders in political dialogue and political decision-making processes. And it's out of that conviction that we also following up and directly advocating for indeed recognition of the positive role young people can bring to those processes. And that is also a follow-up to the Security Council Resolution 2250 that was passed in 2015, and also the follow-up that needed to be given on that resolution also by member states of the UN, but also by other stakeholders. We see the demographic change in many countries of the world where young people are the majority of the inhabitants of many countries. But we also see the stigmatization and the way they are being perceived as potentially troublemakers. And I think that one thing that the Security Council Resolution 2250 made a landmark change in is indeed the point of departure should be different, and we have been actively supported. We need to see young people as potentially change makers, and the change makers that need to be enabled in a position that they can actually contribute. They need to be meaningfully involved and engaged in both the decision-making processes, and they should not be only on the menu, but they should be determining the way forward. And it's not something for them as future generations. No, it's for them now as an active actor in societies that they need to be. And I heard the earlier episodes of your podcast with some of my colleagues, which I dearly, call my good friends, who have been advocating, of course, also in that context for this agenda of peace and security to be brought forward. And that is taking root, I think. There's clearly now progress made in a number of countries where there are clear action plans for this agenda to move forward, but more work still needs to be done.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that, because when I started interacting with the youth, I must say, I was also pleasantly surprised. I did not know that the youth of today are so clear-minded in many ways. I was at times even taken aback by some of their comments and a lot of what they are doing. So for me also, actually, it was a revelation, I must say.
Linked to the Security Council Resolution 2250, it talks about, the inclusion of young people in decision, in making sure that they are not left outside of discussion table talking about the role of young people. I also do think that what we see in many countries where we are active as a platform, and we have a lot of young peace builders, but also youth-led organizations part of our membership. And they are telling us the agenda is moving forward. But there's also still challenges, I think, in many countries where, as I said earlier, it's not a given that young people in society are being recognized as an active group that are automatically included in decision or discussion processes. But it's also, next to that, a matter of creating opportunities and creating an enabling environment for young people to also see the potential for them to develop, whether it's education, inclusion of political decision-making processes. It's also employment opportunities and having the means and having the opportunities for actually finding themselves a place in a society that is recognized and that is valued. And I think that is part and parcel of the social fabric and the cohesion that needs to be strived for by many of the societal actors. And that recognition needs to come also with concrete actions and with concrete steps that manifest change for people, for all society members, for us to believe in think move forward, but also to generate opportunities for all in a society to move.
You know what I found most important? One of the most important aspects of what you're doing currently is the inclusion of civil society. Now, coming from the outside, I always felt that many times decisions are taken in boardrooms and across the table, and people down the line somewhere and the civil society have to at times bear the brunt of the final decisions without having had any idea of what is to come. Even if you see a lot of wars which happen, one person, or let's say a board, decided, okay, let's go to war. And finally, the brunt is borne by the whole country, which is largely a lot of the civil society. So I found the inclusion of civil society in coming to decisions as a very, in the parlance, in today's parlance, the word that we use, very inclusive way of going about trying to find solutions.
Yeah, but it's not a given. I just want to make a side mark on yes, it means at the forefront of what we do and what we stand for and what we strive for is to have this meaningful inclusion of civil society secured in both political dialogue process. And I referenced earlier the International Dialogue on Peacebuilding and State Building is a unique partnership in that sense because it formalizes and recognizes the interaction between governments, donor representatives, and civil society as part of its DNA. That is what is the partnership about. It doesn't say that the agenda is with that secured and finished. What we see happening at the same time is that in many countries across the globe, and even in my own country here, that the space that is granted to non-state actors, to civil society organizations, is not a given, and it's under increasing tension, and that is a key concern. I mean, we can be happy with our engagement in the international dialogue, but we see that tendency and that trend towards the restrictions on civil society and restrictions on civil space across the globe as a growing concern. This has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, and where obviously, I mean, many governments across the globe then put in place restrictions, but we also see the persistent continuation of many restrictions in many countries where we are active, so where we have members on the ground, where that space is a contested space, and where we have to do our best, so to say, to secure and solidify the space to be granted to non-state actors and civil society. So that is also a separate track which we work on as a platform. I mean, we have the international dialogue where we can address the issues and the considerations around necessity of upholding and safeguarding civic space at the international level. But at the same time, we also have to ensure that also donor agencies and the donor capitals of this world also ensure that the space for civil society organizations and actor groups is maintained, because the trend is averse to that. And the trend is not in line with recommendations for the enabling environment for civil society to be put in place, which has been passed by the OECD DAC. We don't see that we don't see that put in place. We don't see that sufficiently supported. As I said, even in my own country, I see that trend towards the space being contested, the space being questioned, which is something of concern, and next to the limitations and restrictions we see in countries where it is even a bigger issue, maybe because the curtailing of space or the control of space by government authorities.
Got it. No, I understand it's not a given. That's quite clear. I'm glad you clarified that. In the scenario that we are, and you have, of course, lived in a variety of countries, do you consider yourself a global citizen, Peter?
It depends on your definition of a global citizen. I am a citizen who is concerned with global issues, I think. Yes. If I'm then therefore a global citizen, I don't know. But I do see myself relating to issues in a larger context.
So thank you for actually saying about the definition of global citizen. What is yours? Because everybody is going by their very different definition. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
No, as I said, I mean, I think that I would see myself as, of course, born and raised in the country in the global north, but very much concerned about the issues at the global scale, and also realizing, recognizing that many of the things we do are interconnected to whatever happens in other places in the world. So in that sense, I'm a global citizen. If I'm concerned by that and also try to add my contribution and try to do something from my point of view or from my position in addressing some of the issues and moving forward.
And is there any thought that you would like to leave behind with the audience today?
I mean, you started off with saying that we find ourselves in a world which is increasingly torn with conflicts, and that is not a desired situation. And I think that's very much touched my brain, and coming back to that point. I do think that there is concern from my end, but also from the point of view of the work that I coordinate, that we see a world in flux at the moment, which is impacted by multiple crises that are also intersecting, but also leading to a lot of maybe trust deficit and fear at the individual citizen level. And I do think that we need to counter that, and we need to bring the agenda of working towards a more sustainable peace and conflict prevention back to the fore, because I do think that that is the solution for us moving forward. As we speak, the world is impacted by major conflicts, but it's not only the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza that should be at the forefront of our attention. We have over 55 conflicts across the globe, which are all impacting on people's individual lives. And our mission and my mission is also to try to have that dialogue with the political duty bearers and to convince them to move towards a greater investment in peace building, conflict mitigation, and conflict prevention in order to make the world a better place, and not to say that this situation and the trend that is evolving is a desired situation. I don't think that everybody or anybody wants this to see further derailing, and I think there's a vested interest of everybody to live in harmony alongside each other, so that peace should then also be on everyone's agenda.
What you mentioned just now brings me to something else which I would like to also bring out. Right now, we are at an evolutionary pace where we are saying technology is the forefront. Now, when we say that technology is at the forefront, how can tech be involved or be part of peace building?
It's an interesting question. It's good that you asked that, because I do think that we have indeed a context in which technology is moving at a high pace, where people often might find it even difficult to follow in terms of what is happening and the speed with which technological developments are actually impacting people's lives. From our end, we have been looking at it from various ways in looking at the potential impacts technology and recent developments can potentially impact on people's lives, but also how these tools and instruments can be used as an element to bring our agenda forward. You might have seen or heard that we are also engaged in what is called a Please Call It podcast, and that Please Call It podcast season that we currently are hosting this year has a direct link to navigating the digital age and looking at what the impacts of technology and technological developments are and how we can relate to them. And also looking at some of the indeed threats that people are perceiving from those developments. So it's been taken up. The challenge is, of course, to see the potential positive benefits and to address potential elements that lead to fear or mistrust. Developments around AI. I mean, that's also an emerging field in relation to peace building. Recent conferences have all included that on their agenda. So it's interesting to see that the peace building community in itself is trying to relate to that. It doesn't have all the answers, but it's certainly at the forefront of attention in seeing how to channel this in the best way possible.
Thank you for sharing that, Peter. I was mentioning, one line to somebody the other day that a knife can be used to cut an apple or kill a person. So I'm assuming when we say technological advancement, bane or boon, there would be both sides. We just have to figure out what is the bane and get on and sort that out.
I think so. That is the engagement with the agenda, quickly evolving agenda, but also seeing the opportunities, but also the potential threats that comes. Then the fact that these developments are going at a pace that so fast can be bringing benefit. The interconnected world nowadays, and what we saw happening with the whole changeover to digitalization when COVID struck, was at the one hand a very good development, of course, because people could still be connected and be engaging. But it's also depending, of course, whether you have that connection through a generator or through the means of electricity in any place in the world. And that is also a cause of concern, of course, because not everybody is able to connect to a grid at all places in the world. So you have to be mindful that it can also be an exclusionary element, which you have to be addressing as well.
Fair enough. That, of course, makes larger picture, makes for a larger picture. Thank you, Peter, for joining me today, and do continue what you are doing. I look forward to seeing a more peaceful world in the coming years, thanks to the efforts by people like yourselves.
Thank you, Meenu, and I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for inviting.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.